Welcome to another episode of History Bites. My name is Julia Ashworth, and I'll be serving as the moderator for all future History Bites. This month, we have Dr. Matthew Champagne with us, who will be leading a discussion on defining LGBTQ plus rights in American history. Dr. Champagne is a public historian and interpretation specialist who has worked at historic sites for more than a decade. Champagne specifically researches the representation of queer past at museums and puts his research into practice through his company, Queering Museums Consulting, which works with museums and historic sites as they strive to better their research, understanding, and presentation of queer history. Today, he will be leading a discussion on queer history in the 18th century, specifically relating to his research on Valley Forge. Alrighty, Matt, why don't you take it away?
Awesome, Julia. Thank you so much for having me here. And huge thanks to you and everyone at Gunston Hall for this generous invitation to talk about my research. Very thankful to have this opportunity to talk about gender and sexuality, especially in George Mason's world, as it's, I think, a topic that does get discussed. It's usually, though, under very heteronormative and cisgender pretenses, especially among sort of the most famous couplings of this time, the gender and sexual politics of people like George and Martha, Dolly and James. But we don't often, I think, complicate the heterosexual assumption of the 18th century, and this gender binary, which was a relatively new import into what would become the United States from Europe, for indigenous communities and American Indian tribes, had adopted third gender identities for thousands of years prior to European colonization. So I can't, unfortunately, get into all of that history, but I do thank you and everyone who is in attendance and watching the recording for taking this bite out of their day to learn a little bit more. So let me go ahead and share some of the visual aids that I've got, um, just as a friendly little help to what I'll be talking about today. So can everybody, or Julia, can you tell me, is what I'm showing
Yes,
awesome
yes.
coming up? Great. So thanks again for having me. My name is Matt Champagne. I use he, him pronouns. I am the founder and principal consultant of Queer and Museums Consulting, and this is an offshoot of my dissertation research, which focused a lot on the representations and interpretations of questionably queer historic figures who once lived at places that are now museums and historic sites. So, as Julia noted, we'll be talking a little bit specifically about Valley Forge, but also talking about how gender and sexual variance in the colonial era and early republic changed between then and now, and how rights have evolved over the last 250 years of this American experiment, and definitely intersected with a lot of Mason's philosophies. So obviously we can't talk about the revolution without talking about Mason, and we can't talk about Mason without talking about the revolution. But as you know, we can't talk about the revolution without also talking about Valley Forge. And to best talk about Valley Forge, we need to almost kind of talk about what it was. And we do so best, arguably, talking about what it was not. So, Valley Forge is a name, a term many of us have probably heard, and those of us who are especially interested in the revolution probably know a bit about. But for those of us who might not be the most knowledgeable of 18th century historians and revolutionary experts, Valley Forge is a site managed by the National Park Service, and it is very intentionally a national historical park. It's not a military park because there was no battle that took place at winter encampments of the Continental Army. So during the winter of 1777 to 78, about 75 plus different regiments all descended on Valley Forge, which is essentially a collection of farmland in southeastern Pennsylvania, about 20 miles south of Philadelphia. And that was very important because about 2 months before the Continental Army set up winter encampment at Valley Forge, they had just surrendered the US capital of Philadelphia to the British. Congress has fled west, I think across like two rivers to get ample distance between themselves and the British. Because if this was any sort of traditional war, this would have essentially signaled the ending of the war, at least for the Americans. Because when an enemy army takes the capital city of that nation, they've essentially claimed victory. Fortunately, the British didn't recognize us as a country. So our sort of ambiguous status meant that we could still continue fighting, but it was very tenuous. It was very tenuous. And I think it's this tenuous nature of the revolution at that time that has really cemented Valley Forge in American consciousness, but in a somewhat sort of mythologized way. So again, some people might think it's a battlefield. That's not really the case. But nonetheless, Valley Forge was very significant for it was really where outside of the Declaration, for the first time, the United States lived up to its motto of E pluribus unum, out of many one. For it was at Valley Forge where these 75 plus different regiments really became for the first time one army. And that was what a lot of historians credit as the reason that the Continental Army had been on a losing streak prior to Valley Forge and saw some major victories post Valley Forge, was because you can take all of the best football players from the Patriots and the Ravens and the Commanders and put them on one team. But if they're not playing from the same playbook, they are going to lose very likely. And against teams even like the Dallas Cowboys, which everyone wins against. No, I'm kidding. Let me not start a fight in the comments. But I should say, so this unification of these different regiments at Valley Forge was largely thanks to Washington's credit. But because Washington also saw the resume of one Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben and realized how invaluable he could be to making these 75 plus different militias into one army. And that's exactly what von Steuben did. So von Steuben was a Prussian who had ample military experience. He had joined the Prussian army when he was a teenager. He had been an aide de camp under Frederick the Great or King Frederick II of Prussia. So he had learned a lot of major military expertise, even rose to the rank of captain. But, he didn't fare too well in peacetime Europe after the end of the 7 Years' War. His rumored relationships with other men were also coming to light. And it meant that he was eventually discharged from his position as a captain. And without work and with connections to people like Ben Franklin, he did eventually find his way over to the colonies and volunteered initially his services for Congress was very suspect of foreigners coming and helping with our military organization. But he proved himself so invaluable at Valley Forge that eventually he did, at Washington's recommendation, get a congressional commission to be inspector general and earned the rank of major general. And what he did at Valley Forge was very substantial. For, as I said, he took these 75 different militias, regiments, and made one army. And he did so largely through authoring the book that you see on the screen, which was popularly known as the Blue Book. It was how von Steuben sought about organizing these regiments under one set of plays. And it was so influential that the US Army still refers to their basic training manual as the Blue Book. And all this to say that Valley Forge is very significant, and also Valley Forge is very queer. For von Steuben, not only had these rumored relationships over in Europe, but when he was living at Valley Forge, he also was living there with two aides de camp, a Benjamin North and a William Walker, men whom he maintained a relationship with even after the war for the remainder of his life, whom he set up a household with after the war, whom he adopted as his children, which we see in a few different examples of unmarried, fatherless, possibly queer people acknowledging in some way, shape, and form in the 18th century through the few channels they had their most significant connections in life, people whom they perhaps would have married, but were, of course, uneligible to do so at that time. Now, it's not just von Steuben who is speculated to have been a queer possibility at Valley Forge. There were also other examples of queer individuals participating and being at Valley Forge. Particularly, Frederick Einstein stands in a particularly stark contrast to von Steuben. For von Steuben was allowed to live this somewhat open secret in the 18th century, which we see actually in a few different examples, not only during the Revolution, but also throughout the colonial era and through up into the early Republic, because how one's sexual deviations, variations, were thought of culturally, prosecuted prematurely, largely depended on one's race, one's gender, and one's socioeconomic status. And this is a great example because at Valley Forge, von Steuben, because of his significant contributions to the cause, is able to live this somewhat open secret. Washington's able to turn a blind eye to some of the rumors he's heard about von Steuben in Europe. Meanwhile, Washington also personally approved of Frederick Einstein being drummed out of Valley Forge for attempted sodomy with another soldier. He actually was the first U.S. soldier ever court-martialed for this crime. A sentence that was carried out in March of 1778, so just near the end of the disbanding of Valley Forge. There wasn't also just sexual variation that we see at Valley Forge. We also see some gender bending and potential intersex identities at Valley Forge and throughout the Revolution. Casimir Pulowski is a very great example of this. Pulowski was born to a Polish noble family, and the baptisms and christenings of Polish nobility, or just nobility generally, especially in regards to sons, is a very scrutinized ceremony and ritual. And so we do know that Pulowski was identified male at birth, identified as a son. But we also know that during their life, Pulowski kept their body a very sort of closely guarded entity. So much so that even in death, they were buried in secret. Where they were buried, though, was passed down in an oral tradition through the folks enslaved nearby. Eventually, Pulowski's remains were exhumed, and they were sort of confirmed to be Pulowski's by the skeleton and the injuries that the skeleton had sustained in life, corresponding with the injuries that Pulowski was known to have sustained during wartime. And at the same time, there were aspects of the skeleton that suggested Pulowski or this individual had traditional female anatomy in certain parts, such as the shape of the pelvis, the structuring of the jaw. So we don't know exactly how Pulowski would have identified today, but it's very likely that this person who was so instrumental in making sure that the people at Valley Forge were fed adequately was also an intersex human, someone who is popularly remembered as the father of the American cavalry, but perhaps should be more accurately remembered as the founder. We have another example of sort of a crossing of gender lines from the just revolutionary more general, and that is in Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson was someone identified female at birth who seemed to identify with the gender of woman, but at the same time who gender bent in order to participate in the revolution and as a man, specifically under the name of Robert Shurtleff. A persona that came to light as not her authentic one when she was injured, but one that did not seem to earn Sampson incredible scrutiny. In fact, Sampson went on to talk about herself as the female soldier, authored about her experience, even petitioned for her pension, which eventually she did receive from not only the federal level, but also the state, thanks in part to Paul Revere himself intervening. So I bring up all these examples to show the diversity of gender and sexuality, or gender and sexual expression during the revolution. And to conclude, I want to sort of bring in what it tells us, and that's kind of that it tells us nothing. But also tells us so much, because I think there's a large assumption that any deviation from sexual or gender norms back in this time was met with absolute scrutiny almost immediately and happened infrequently. When in fact, we see that there was a lot of sexual and gender variation, even just in this sort of one small moment of the revolution. And we see that it is scrutinized both officially and socially in a variety of ways that largely are based in one's privileges outside of their sexual or gender identities. And we do see some very strict scrutiny of people who deviated from gender and sexual norms. But what is actually kind of interesting is that some of the most common and most severe punishments were for people who violated um, heterosexual norms of marriage and it being for procreation. It seems as though in the 17th and 18th century, powers that be were the most concerned about sexual crimes that threatened the fabric of society and put a potential burden on a state that didn't have a great welfare system. So, people who had extramarital affairs that could lead to the dissolution of a marriage and could leave a woman without a husband and therefore dependent, or that could result in a child out of wedlock, and then a question of who's responsible for that child, who raises it. And we see queer people kind of live in open secret up until homosexuality and other sexual and gender variances start to be classified by medical communities in the mid 1800s. And it's when medical communities start to classify what is and what is not homosexuality, transgender identity, and comparable things that we start to see bureaucracy also take a very scrutinizing eye toward these same identities. And for lots of very same reasons. We see at immigration checkpoints like Ellis Island and Angel Island that immigrants are having their bodies read for signs of effeminacy, for homosexuality, for transgender identity, because the bureaucracy thinks that these people will be less efficient at work, will perhaps be harassed by fellow colleagues and unemployed, and then again dependent on the state. So it's a very interesting connection, but also change over time. But it just goes to show us that as queer people became more visible, they also felt the need to define for themselves what queer visibility looked like. And that's where we eventually see the gay liberation movement of the 20th century. That's where we see the right to love each other become really the first fight that queer people take up. Hence why queer people are so often associated with hypersexuality, which is not something of our own doing. It's society making us have to make our love visible so that we could have it legally recognized. A right that was actually not settled by the Supreme Court until 2003 in Lawrence v. Texas. We talk obviously a lot about the Supreme Court nowadays in terms of queer rights, and there is a lot to talk about, but it is not just all marriage equality. It is also gender identity markers on passports. This is also the right to love. And these cases have been heard and decided on along a lot of very different lines. And what I find interesting and what I'll close with is that some justices have claimed that the court has been creating new rights, legislating from the bench, as some might call it, in deciding in the affirmative for queer people to be fully seen as citizens. Um, but I find that criticism quite interesting, considering it was the Bill of Rights that in the Ninth Amendment says this is not an exhaustive list, and that if and then the 10th Amendment, if a right is not already assumed by the feds or the state or isn't outlawed by such, then it belongs to the people. And given Mason's objections to the Constitution because it didn't go far enough and his insistence on a Bill of Rights, I think in a way, we have Mason, at least the thinking of, to thank for the progress we have seen, despite it being in some ways a backslide from what was here prior to colonization, and despite how far we still have to go. But all that, thank you again very much for letting me share a little bit of my research and a bit of a reflection on how the rights of queer people have stayed the same, changed, evolved, progressed, backslide since George Mason's world.
Righty. Thank you so much, Matt. That was a fascinating discussion. And it really touched on a lot of different individuals that, I mean, I had not grown up learning about in my schooling. We do have a question from the audience. If you would be willing to go back to the correct slide that we can touch on. So the question is, why was, correct me if I'm pronouncing their name wrong, Insulin?
I might
Insulin.
also be pronouncing it incorrectly for sure.
Yes,
I've been saying
yes.
Iceland, but I do
Insulin,
not quote me on
yes.
that, please.
Uh, why were they court-martialed and not Steuben? Was it because Steuben and his partners were officers? Is it, a rank thing? Is it, how exactly did that work out?
So that is a great question, and one that we don't have an exact answer on. I, through my research and through sort of a educated guess, can speculate that it is for many different reasons. So Einstein was a private, meaning, ironically, he didn't have a lot of privacy. He was often sharing these quickly fabricated log cabins or these tent cities with so many other folks who were all in such close proximity to each other. Now, that close proximity and that intimacy does make queer possibilities all the more possible. Unfortunately, also makes the folks who are unfriendly to those people more aware of those happenings. Whereas von Steuben and his aides de camp, because of his rank, would have enjoyed the possibility of a little more privacy than the average enlistee or conscript would have known.
For sure.
So it's very likely the different spatial arrangements that they are living in, despite both being at Valley Forge, which can look like so many different things, as you mentioned, very likely to do with also the rank and the contribution that they are able to make to the war effort. Von Steuben, again, is credited with turning our losing streak into a winning one. And that would not have been the same credit that Einstein could have taken. So Washington very likely felt comfortable sacrificing this one private to set an example of what he expected in his army, while one of his officers behind closed doors was perhaps engaging in similar behavior. And not something that Washington really felt the need to rock the boat on, perhaps, despite the rumors he had heard of von Steuben from Europe, because again, von Steuben was able to most significantly contribute to the war effort.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
No, I appreciate the question.
And then we
Appreciate the
have
question.
another question for you. How did you come to this research? What sort of drew you to it? It's such a fascinating topic.
I appreciate that. It's a selfish endeavor, I will 100% say. So I am a gay person, and I've been working in historic sites for all of my professional career and have really taken a tremendous amount of joy of helping folks, visitors, see themselves in the past to help connect them with that sense of identity. And it's something that I kind of struggled to see. And so I was made aware by other colleagues older than myself of some queer possibilities where I was completely unaware there were such. So to then help myself sort of better understand my place in the past, I sought about I sought to find these places of queer significance. And so it meant cold calling every state historic society and state preservation office in the contiguous United States, tapping into a whisper network among colleagues, reading almost all 1,400 plus pages of the National Park Service's theme study,
Oh,
as
wow.
well as Paula Montax. I forget her last name, and I hate that. But her book from the 90s of like the queerest places. So it's out there. This information is out there. But
Yes.
unfortunately, it's in some ways kept intentionally disparate. And so I've just been trying to bring it all together for folks as best I can.
Yeah,
Fortunately, I'm not
absolutely.
alone, Army. Thank you. For the chat, Paula Martinak. I hope I was saying that correctly.
Yes. That's great. Thank you so much again. I was actually going to ask you about your methods. So that was sort of tying that in. Was there anything surprising that you found? Anything that, you know, excited you or that you just, didn't really realize was going to be the case, that sort of thing? Anything that you found in your research that was surprising?
I hate to say it, but that like we were always there. Yeah,
Yes.
but it is like you were noting how this highlighted some elements that you had heard about, like Valley Forge, but not necessarily people who you had heard about or people you were
For
aware of and
sure.
you had rumors about, but
Yes.
nothing sort of significantly. Um, and so it just I know made me think that like if I had heard about the queer possibility of the essentially founder of the American Army having been also a man who desired other men, it would have given me a tremendously different perspective at my very formative stages of what was possible for me
For sure.
and in my life and what the United States means to me.
Yeah.
Um, so just seeing not only that we were always there, but how we've shown up, because a lot of time the earliest references to queerness that young queer people hear about is of hate crimes, of jailing, and things of that nature. But not to undermine those, because those are very significant things for us to discuss and acknowledge, but also to acknowledge the incredible ways that queer people have contributed to the construction of the United States and all the good that it has done and is capable of doing, is something that doesn't get noted enough. But the same is true for immigrant communities, for people of religious minority backgrounds, Black folk. So we are just one element, ignoring intersectionality, of course, for a minute here, because these do intersect um, for many people. But it's a coalition of folks who have unfortunately not been always recognized as they should in U.S. history, and hence why I invoke the term revisionist proudly. History was written incorrectly for the longest time, and I think it's up to us now as historians to do the good rewriting to make sure that it is a full and accurate truth telling.
Absolutely, absolutely. On that note, I do just want to thank you again so very much for joining us at Gunston Hall and for being our very last History Bites of 2025. And thank you so much to our audience for tuning in. Please do join us in the new year for our latest mini series on the rights of the incarcerated. Dr. Emily Norweg will be leading this discussion on Wednesday, January 21st. We hope to see you there. And as always, stay hungry.